Behold, the Lord is riding on a swift cloud and comes to Egypt. And the ungods of Egypt will waver from before his face, and the heart of the Egyptians will melt within them. Hello, everybody. This is Gilgamesh. And today we're going to be talking about Isaiah chapter 19. This is part of my ongoing series on the book of Isaiah, and we are in a section right now that we call the Oracles About the Nations. And we have here a new oracle, a new Masah, as it's called in Hebrew, that is about Egypt. And this is one of a section here that is on either Kush or Egypt. And at this time, of course, Egypt was ruled by Kush, being the 25th dynasty. And we discussed that in my last video. But here we're going to focus particularly on Egypt. And this chapter has two sections. The first section isn't very fun for Egypt. It sounds like it's going to be a very bad time. But then we make a very distinct transition in the middle of the chapter and go to a very different kind of message. And so this seems to be contrasting ideas here about Egypt and its future. And it somewhat explicitly states that in the writing itself. So let's get into it here. In verse 1 here, we have an oracle concerning Egypt, a Masah concerning Egypt. This is the same word that we've discussed several times. It means something that is carried. Behold, the Lord is riding on a swift cloud and comes to Egypt. This imagery here of the Lord riding on a cloud, it is a common mythological image that we find a lot throughout Canaanite poetry, and it's used several times in the biblical Psalms. It says here, and the ungods of Egypt will waver from before his face, and the heart of the Egyptians will melt within them. Fairly straightforward here. The word that we're translating as ungods is Elilim, which is sort of an insulting term for foreign gods. It indicates that they lack power, that they are maybe, godlets, mini gods or powerless gods, but that these gods of Egypt that the Egyptians are so proud of will waver. They will cower in front of the majesty of the God of Israel. And the Egyptians themselves will have their hearts melt, that they will be in fear. And it says in verse 2 here, and I will stir up Egyptians against Egyptians, and they will fight. A man against his brother, and a man against his neighbor, city against city, kingdom against kingdom. This word here for stir up is another fun Hebrew word, shikshachti. It is possibly an Ethiopic loanword, and it is used only in Isaiah. It is used here and then back in chapter 9, verse 10. It has this typical Isaiah feature of a repeated syllable, which he seems to really enjoy. As we talk about here, a man against his brother and a man against his neighbor, we are obviously talking about civil war. The idea here, city versus city and kingdom versus kingdom, this is an internal clash which will be very unpleasant for Egypt. Sometimes kingdom versus kingdom, we think that this may be a clash between the northern and southern kingdoms of Egypt, what's sometimes called Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Others see this as perhaps different districts of Egypt that are ruled by different princes. And so we're not entirely clear what the scope is when we say kingdom versus kingdom, because Egypt had a lot of different ideas of how it could be divided into kingdoms. Civil war seems to be a bit of a recurring theme in Egypt's long history, but it can seem overly so because that history is so long. Egypt also had centuries of unified rule, as well as centuries of just complete petty infighting. It really had both extremes, and both would tend to last for very long periods of time. In the time of Isaiah, as we mentioned, it was dominated by Kush in the 25th dynasty. It was a time of uneasy order. The native Egyptians resented the rule of the foreign Nubians as their ruling class, and it's going to all be brought to a crashing end with the help of the Assyrians, who will restore the native rule through a series of puppet kings in the coming decades. It says then, and the spirit of the Egyptians within them shall be emptied out, and their counsel I will confound. And they will inquire to the ungods, and to the ghosts, and to the revenants, and to the necromancers. So we have here the idea that the Egyptians in their terror are going to turn to what they do best. They're going to turn to their native gods and to the various cult of the dead, which was a very major part of Egyptian religion, to understand what to do next. Now, this word here, confound, the word also means to swallow up. The word that we're translating as ghost is this word itim, which only occurs here, and its meaning was unknown for a good while, but we have found similar words in Akkadian and Sumerian, which means the ghost of a dead person. And so ghost seems like the correct translation here. The word translated as revenants is the Hebrew word ov. And again, a word that we weren't sure exactly what it meant. The word ov is understood to mean the spirit of the dead raised by necromancy. And this is based on a possible Syriac cognate. And this word is used a few times. But there is also possibly a Hittite word that this may have come from, which indicates a sacrificial pit. And it is frequently paired with the word for necromancer that occurs right after it. And the understanding is that this may have been a special sacrificial pit used for communicating with the dead. So when it says that they are going to ask of the Ov, it may be referring to a very specific ritual place where they communicated with the dead. The final word here, Yodoni, is necromancers, and it is the same word that we had back in chapter 8, where I went into it in some detail. These, of course, are people who communicate with the dead, who do necromancy. That's what it really is. So this was a major cult throughout. Most of the Middle East had some type of a cult of the dead. Egypt, though, was particularly famous for its very elaborate death cults. And I will give over the Egyptians into the hand of a hard master, and a fierce king will rule over them, declares the master, Lord of hosts. This word I will give over. There are some homonyms, but this word probably only occurs here. We think that this is a bit of a unique word. Where we see it elsewhere, it seems to be possibly a different word being used. So he's going to give over the Egyptians into the hand of a hard master. The word for hand and the adjective hard indicate a singular master here. But then the word for master is plural. It actually says over into the hand of a hard masters, which is kind of odd. The word here for master or masters is Adoni. It is the same word that is used just a little bit later in this same verse to refer to the master, Lord of hosts. Perhaps this is an intentional contrast that is intended here. The word master is not usually prepended to the title Lord of hosts, and the Greek and the Syriac translations do not have this extra word here in the title. The Lord of Hosts, of course, is his militaristic title, and it might be intended to portray the Lord as also being harsh. But we have here this prophecy that the Egyptians will be in a panic, that they will be looking to their gods and their dead spirits to give them guidance, and that they will be handed over into some type of a hard master, a fierce king that's going to rule over them. And then things get worse. And the waters will be drained from the sea, and the river will be parched and dry. Well, this idea here that they're going to be drained, the waters here, it's a fairly rare word that is used only in Isaiah and Jeremiah. The idea that they will be dried up, dried, parched. Isaiah uses 3 different words in this verse that mean dry, essentially. This is clearly for emphasis on the subject of them losing their water supply, but it is also an opportunity for Isaiah to flex his rather impressive vocabulary. Biblical writers often took envy on Egypt's abundant sources of irrigation from the Nile and from elsewhere, which were a striking contrast to the land of Israel, which had to depend on rainfall in order for anything to grow. And so it gives a bit of a special edge to this prophecy where Egypt is going to be drained and dried up, because this was part of Egypt's great power. The power of any society at this point in time was its agricultural base. And Egypt could grow crops and cotton and all sorts of things like that in great abundance. because of their natural water supplies, which were abundant, and the nation of Israel had very scarce water supplies. That remains a problem in that region today, that they really could not have the same type of agricultural output and thus sway throughout the world as Egypt could. Trade was a major factor in how powerful a nation could grow. Continuing with the same theme, it says, and its canals will become foul, and the branches of Egypt's Nile will diminish and dry up. This word for foul, it only occurs here, and the Dead Sea Scrolls have a different spelling of the word. The translation of what it means is mostly a guess from context. It says, reeds and rushes will rot away. This word rot away only occurs here. And the meaning that we have for it is derived from similar words that we have in both Syriac and Arabic, which mean to turn black or to become moldy. And so the idea is, with the water gone, the canals are going to become stagnant, and the vegetation that is there is going to simply rot. So this land that had been a land where papyrus grew and cotton grew and all sorts of foodstuffs grew is going to become a dried out land with rotting vegetation. And then we have this great verse 7 here, which is broken into 2 sections of 3 lines each. Vegetation by the Nile, by the mouth of the Nile, and all sown land of the Nile will be parched, will be driven away, and it will be no more. We have here the word Nile repeated 3 times in this verse, followed by 3 words of doom. This was done for emphasis and symmetry here, that the Nile is going to be destroyed. This great thing which gave Egypt its power, both in agriculture and in easy transportation and shipping, it's going to be destroyed. The word here for vegetation is, again, only used here. It seems to be an Egyptian loanword. Others have tried to translate it as things like bare patches, but it seems to be that it is some type of plant based on the context here. So I think vegetation is probably the better choice of translation there. The emphasis here does seem to be that the natural growth around the Nile is going to be disrupted significantly. Now, of course, the Nile was more than just growing plants, and so we now go into the other big thing that the Nile was used for. The fishermen will mourn, and all who cast a hook into the Nile will lament, and who spreads nets on the face of the water will wither. The Hebrew actually has a very weird word order here for about casting the hook in the Nile. It actually says in Hebrew very literally, all throwers of in the Nile a hook, which is odd. It's not a normal word order to see in Hebrew or English. But the idea here is that the fishermen who are working on the Nile will suddenly be out of work because there's no longer a functioning Nile. Then the workers in combed flax will be ashamed, and the weavers of white cotton. The word here for combed in combed flax, it again occurs only here, and the meaning is a little bit uncertain. It is based off of some older translations that translated it as combed, that it was this particular type of combed flax, but it still is largely a guess. So we're hoping that the guess of the older translators was better than our current guesses. So yeah, we don't know what kind of flax exactly, but it does seem to be here that we're talking about agricultural workers again, but ones that are producing textiles that are going to be affected as well. Now, the word for white cotton here, which is korai, occurs only here. This idea that it is white cotton is based on the spelling of this word in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but it is also a unique word that doesn't really occur elsewhere. Some have suggested that with the Dead Sea Scrolls version, it might actually not be a noun, but it might be a verb, in which case, rather than simply meaning white, as in white cotton, that it might mean to turn pale, and that this might be saying, and the weavers turn pale. So we have here the workers being ashamed and the weavers turning pale. That also could work, and it could make a stronger parallel with the previous line. But the word here that we have, chori, suggests white stuff, and really that's all we really know about this. And so we assume that this is referring to the cotton based on the context, but it could also be that they are turning pale, that they are turning white. Her weavers will be crushed, and all who work for pay will be grieved of soul. Her weavers, the word here is shatot, and it occurs only here. This is not the same word that we translated as weavers in the last verse. This is a different word that also we think means weavers. Its meaning is based on similar words that show up in Akkadian and Coptic. Older guesses for what this word meant included her foundations and was interpreted as meaning leaders of the community. But we're pretty sure that that's not right. That this is, again, talking about textile workers here, that they will be crushed and those who work for pay will be grieved. This word for grieved here, again, it only occurs here, and it is a bit of a guess from context, although it looks a lot like the rather uncommon word for reed that shows up in verse 15, which we're going to get to. And there might be an intentional play on words here because they are going to lose their leadership, which is referenced as a reed, that this also has to do with the grieving of the workers who will not be able to find employment anymore. Now, King James Version, not knowing what most of these words meant, got incredibly creative, and they have this verse talking about sluices and ponds for fish. And I have no idea how they got there, but that's completely wrong. This seems to be talking about textile workers not being able to make their products. Then as we come into verse 11 here, we have, fools are the princes of Zoan. The wisest counselors of Pharaoh give stupid counsel. Well, this word Zoan is also known as the city of Tanis. Now, you may remember Tanis from a particular archaeological expedition that happened back in the 1940s, where Dr. Jones was able to retrieve the lost Ark of the Covenant from this city that had been swallowed up in a sandstorm that lasted an entire year. Yes, that's all very well documented. But yes, Zoan is this city of Tanis. It is part of the northeastern delta of the Nile, and it is in the vicinity of Lake Minzalises. It's a fairly well-known archaeological site. The idea here that his wisest counselors are giving stupid counsel, it's actually missing the verb give here. And so we kind of have to supply that ourselves. But Egypt was known and renowned for its wisdom and its wisdom literature. But here the important part is that the wisdom is going to fail, that those who would normally be looked at as the wisest in the world will not be able to give good counsel at this time. And we come in now to this questioning bit here. How can you say to Pharaoh, I am a son of the wise ones, a son of the kings of the east? A lot to unpack in that verse here. We're deriding the counselors here that are telling Pharaoh that they are wise. But the idea of being a son of something often meant to be a disciple of something. And so these are people who have studied the wise ones of old, who have studied the kings of the east. Now, that is what it says literally as kings of the east. East, however, has a lot of symbolic meaning. And one of the things, of course, with the east is that it is the origin of where the sun rises. And so the word can mean original or ancient, sort of the OG kings. So we are the son of the kings, the original kings, the sons of the ancient kings. So they are saying here that they have this wisdom that has been handed down from generations, from mighty royal lines. And so this is what they're selling themselves to Pharaoh as these great people. And so we challenge this. We say, where are they? Where are your wise men? Let them tell you and make known, what has the Lord of hosts planned for Egypt? And so we challenge these wise men of Egypt to actually accurately predict what it is that's going to happen to Egypt. Isaiah is being very challenging here that he doesn't believe they will give correct or reliable advice. And he emphasizes it here, foolish are the princes of Zoan. Gullible are the princes of Noph. Just as Zoan was Tanis, Noph is the city of Memphis. Now, this foolish and gullible here, this line is quite similar to the opening line from back in verse 11. but Isaiah uses a different insulting word here. Both of the words in this verse are verbs in Hebrew, but we don't have a lot of great verbs in English that mean to become foolish or to hold overly optimistic beliefs. So when I translated this, I kind of had to go for adjectives here that they're gullible or foolish. But in the original Hebrew, they are actually verbs. This word here that is translated as gullible, it is based on an Arabic cognate that might also have the meaning of being intoxicated, which is going to lead into the metaphor that we're about to go into. So it might mean that they are just overly credulous in what they believe, or it might mean that they're a little tipsy. But as we go forward, we come into this idea of intoxication here. They have made Egypt stagger, the cornerstones of her tribes. Well, the staggering here, of course, brings up the idea of intoxications. The cornerstones of her tribes, the traditional text actually has a singular word here, cornerstone of her tribes, but both the Targum and the Syriac suggest that this word should be plural, and that seems more likely in context here. It's clearly a metaphor for the best of her citizens, that they have made Egypt a stagger, and the very best of her citizens, the most powerful, the most honorable, are being caught up in this drunkenness. The Lord has mixed within her a spirit of confusion, and they will make Egypt stagger in all his deeds, as a drunk staggers in his vomit. So the word mixed here is a verb that is often associated with intoxicating drinks. It's also, interestingly, there is a homonym of this word that indicates the veil of the temple, and I don't know if anything should be made of that or not, but this word here, mixed, is a particular thing you do with alcoholic intoxicating drinks. The word confusion here, that the spirit of confusion, this only occurs here. Its meaning is uncertain. The Dead Sea Scrolls have a different spelling of the word. Well, that word in the Dead Sea Scrolls is also unknown. It makes it look a bit like Isaiah took a word that means confusion, which is ava, and made a new word out of it, which would be avavim. And this again fits Isaiah because he loves these repeated syllables, and the Dead Sea Scrolls preserves that idea of a repeated syllable here based on the word confusion. And that may be what's actually happening here. It would fit well with the idea of drunkenness, that they have this spirit of confusion. Also, interestingly, Egypt seems to have switched genders here. The previous line had within her, and now it has his deeds. And so why did it switch from male to female? We don't really know. The Greek and the Targum switched it actually to a plural pronoun and used the word there in both cases. And so I guess that is apparently what you are supposed to do when you cannot decide if something is a he or a she. You're supposed to use the plural pronoun there. That's what the Bible does. So there you have it. Now we have the word stagger here is used 3 times, and it reaches this vomiting crescendo on the 3rd time here, that as a drunk staggers in his vomit. Each time we are getting more explicit at how terrible the staggering is, the drunkenness is. And in verse 15, and there will not be for Egypt a worker which works. Head and tail, palm branch and reed. This is clearly a reference back to Isaiah chapter 9, verse 14, where it said, therefore the Lord will cut off from Israel head and tail, branch and reed in one day. Egypt was known for its intellectuals and its great religion. This saying is that the great scholars and the devout priests are going to fail. The same thing that was said of Israel back in chapter 9, verses 14 and 15. So we have to ask with this, why is Egypt being spoken of in the same language that Israel was spoken of? And we have to ask, what is Egypt? Are we talking about the literal Egypt in this? Or is Egypt possibly some type of a symbolic stand-in? It does not seem like Isaiah is actually talking about the ancient kingdom of Egypt. And this comes to our turning point. As we end with these words here: head and tail, palm branch and reed, the same words that were declared against Israel. We now come to a moment where we shift perspective entirely in this chapter. What we're going to see following this is 5 separate prophecies. And each of these 5 prophecies starts with the same phrase, in that day. The style of the text notably changes here. And we have to ask, what day are we talking about? Apparently, it is the day when Egypt's religion and knowledge failed them. And so what is to happen? We have here the first prophecy. In that day, the Egyptians will be like women and tremble with fear before the hand that the Lord of hosts shakes over them. And the land of Judah will become a terror to the Egyptians. Everyone to whom it is mentioned will fear, because of the purpose that the Lord of hosts has proposed against them. This comes back to the way we started this, that their hearts will melt within them. But who are they going to be afraid of? They are going to be afraid of the people of the land of Judah. Now, that never happened in ancient times. Egypt was never afraid of Judah. Judah never had such a prominent position of power. It has happened in modern times. You can look at the 6-Day War or the Yom Kippur War. There is very good examples of Egypt being terrified of Judah. But in the ancient world, this did not happen. Now, I will point out here, because I love this particular style of writing, the purpose the Lord has proposed is a cognate accusative, where your direct object is the same root as your verb that occurs in Hebrew, and it's reflected here in this translation. But the idea here is that Egypt is going to be terrified because of the people of Judah. Okay, verse 18. In that day, there will be 5 cities in the land of Egypt that speak the language of Canaan and swear allegiance to the Lord of hosts. One of these will be called the city of the sun. Okay, why 5 cities? And maybe that has to do with the fact that we have 5 prophecies here at the end. I don't know. But apparently there will be 5 cities that speak Canaanite. Now, Hebrew was not called Hebrew back then. It was called the language of Canaan, or Canaanite. And this is what it's saying, is that in Egypt, there will be 5 cities that will speak the language of Israel. They'll be speaking Hebrew, basically, in these cities. And one of them is going to be the city of the sun, which is probably a reference to Heliopolis. When it comes to dating this text, we think this is probably very early, because it seems to be still focused on Assyria. The notion that the Egyptians will become worshipers of the God of Israel might have been encouraged by a time when there was a large and vigorous diaspora community in Egypt, which would have been the case at least as early as the 5th century BCE. Proposals to locate any of these prophecies as late as the 2nd century BCE don't make any sense, really. And so why would we think that Egypt was going to suddenly become Hebrew speaking? It's hard to say. Once the Jews were destroyed by the Babylonians at 600 BC or so, there was a large diaspora, and you'll find that Jeremiah was part of this, and they went to Egypt. That community would become a major part of Jewish influence from there on out, Alexandria becoming a great spot that was very prominent in Egypt. So some of this does happen. There is a large Jewish presence in Egypt. However, they did not speak Hebrew. They tended to speak Greek or the Egyptian languages. The reference here to one of the cities is going to be called the city of the sun. Well, the traditional Masoretic text actually reads the city of destruction, which is Ir Heres. And some Hebrew manuscripts, as well as several ancient translations, actually read a different way, a much more plausible Ir Heres, which is city of the sun, which is probably the reference to Heliopolis. And we think that this was a scribal error that caused this. The 2 letters look extremely similar. And Paris is a less common synonym for the sun. Perhaps they were influenced by the first half of the chapter that was talking so much about destruction that they saw this word as meaning destruction and copied it down incorrectly. But it seems much more likely that this is saying that one of the cities will be Heliopolis. So that's our second prophecy. We go into the third prophecy here. In that day, there will be an altar to the Lord in the midst of the land of Egypt, and a pillar to the Lord at its border. It will be a sign and a witness to the Lord of hosts in the land of Egypt. And they will cry to the Lord because of oppressors, and he will send them a savior, and he will go down and deliver them. And the Lord will be known to the Egyptians, and the Egyptians will know the Lord in that day. And they will work a sacrifice and an offering, and they will vow a vow to the Lord, and they shall fulfill. A lot to unpack in that. We are talking about that there will be a temple setting in Egypt, an altar, and that there's going to be a pillar at their border saying that this land is land which is dedicated to the God of Israel, to the Lord. This is obviously a major shift. This never occurred in any historical setting, but it's going to be a sign and a witness to them here, and they're going to cry to the Lord because of their oppressors. Again, this is very odd that they have adopted this. They are going to be oppressed, I presume, by this mighty king that was mentioned earlier. Possibly these are the Assyrians. That is what would happen to them. They will cry to the Lord because of these oppressors, and then he's going to send them a savior, someone who is going to redeem them from the clutches of this powerful king. And some translations have here a savior and defender and deliver them. I went with a savior and he will go down and deliver him. The traditional text has varav, which actually kind of means and he will argue, usually in reference to like a legal setting. And so this is someone who argues your case in court, an advocate, which also could work. But based on the Septuagint felt it should be a noun here. And so some translations go with and a defender. That also works, or an advocate. The Dead Sea Scrolls variant here, though, suggests that it should be a verb, but a different verb, which is the verb yarad, which is to go down. So, and he will go down, which I think works better in context. He will send them a savior. He will go down and deliver them. Seems to parallel each other quite nicely, I think. I think that's the better reading here. But they are going to vow vows, another cognate accusative, and they're going to fulfill them. So they're making these covenant promises with God, and they are going to fulfill them. The word here for fulfill comes from the same root as the word shalom, which means peace. To fulfill something is to make it complete or whole or at peace. So they are going to create these vows with the Lord, and they are going to make those vows whole or complete. Then this great verse here, and the Lord will strike Egypt, striking and healing, and they will return to the Lord, and he will be entreated of them and heal them. Striking and healing. So this will both be a punishment for Egypt that will cause them to suffer, but it is intended to heal them. And they're going to return to the Lord, which is an unusual thing for people who have not worshiped the Lord in the past to say that they will return to the Lord. And it seems to be implying that these people he is speaking of previously were looking to the Lord. It is very difficult to understand what we're talking about here in a historical context, but particularly these oracles about the nations seem to be a bit divorced from history, and we are speaking more in symbols. And so this nation of Egypt will turn back to its worship of the Lord, and he will listen to them and heal them from their problems. The idea here that the Egyptians will have a temple and that it'll be a functioning temple. There actually was a functioning Jewish temple in Egypt, which was well after Isaiah's time. We are still learning quite a lot about it, and it's unclear if the God of Israel was worshipped there exclusively or if he was worshipped there in conjunction with other Canaanite gods. We have sort of mixed messages from the archaeology we have found so far. But there is some evidence that the Jews in Jerusalem knew of that temple and approved of it. So it is a really confusing and interesting thing. This temple was located at a place in Egypt known as Elephantine. And I will actually link to a couple of articles if you're interested in reading more about that temple in the comments. But was that the temple that Isaiah saw? Or was he seeing something else? We don't know. But the Egyptians apparently will be offering sacrifices and making vows and keeping those vows. Prophecy 4. In that day, there will be a highway from Egypt to Assyria, and Assyria will come into Egypt, and Egypt into Assyria, and the Egyptians will serve with the Assyrians. Okay, so there's going to be this international highway between two very far-flung kingdoms. Now, Assyria and Egypt were the world powers in Isaiah's day. Everybody else was a very minor player compared to these two gigantic kingdoms. There's going to be a highway between these two really powerful kingdoms, and they're going to be going back and forth between it. So there's going to be peace between the two major world powers, and sounds like commerce happening between them. And then this last line here, the Egyptians will serve with the Assyrians. The way it's written, it could also be read as the Egyptians will serve the Assyrians, as in the Egyptians will be enslaved to the Assyrians, but that seems to contradict everything else in this section of the chapter here. It can also be read as serve with the Assyrians, which seems much more likely. The word serve here is a very broad word, avad. It can mean everything from being in slavery to doing service in the temple. And actually, just back in verse 21, the same exact word was used for working a sacrifice in the temple. And it often refers to temple work. So when we say the Egyptians will serve with the Assyrians here, I think the most likely reading of what this is saying is that both will be involved in this temple work that they're describing happening in the nation of Egypt. And so these two major powers that were in opposition to the kingdom of Judah are going to become allied, and they are going to be together doing service in the temple to the God of Israel. A very unusual vision of the future. And then we go into the final fifth prophecy of the chapter here. In that day, Israel will be the third with Egypt and Assyria, and a blessing in the midst of the earth, whom the Lord of hosts has blessed, saying, Blessed be Egypt, my people, and Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, my inheritance. Well, that's interesting. This final two verses here in this chapter say that there will be peace in the Middle East with all the major powers, and that Israel will be one of those three great powers. They're all going to get along. They're going to serve the Lord together, and there's going to be unified religion throughout. This obviously has no parallel or connection with anything in our history. This has not occurred yet in any way that can be pointed to, that we have had just peace throughout that entire region. It is a remarkable prediction, but there it is. Egypt, Assyria, and Israel, all friends, all worshiping in the temple and worshiping the Lord God of Israel. And that's where we'll leave it. And we'll see you next time with the next chapter. Thank you very much. Please like and subscribe and share this with your friends if you find this interesting. I'll see you next time.